This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome Eric Kastango. He's an expert consultant and managing partner with Kastango Consulting Group, and quite an expert in the area of compounding pharmacies. So welcome, Eric. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning.
Thanks, Stacey. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk this morning.
Absolutely. A very important topic, Eric, as we talk about the impact of all of these temporary FDA guidances, both how they're impacting the compounding space now and what you anticipate in the future. So I think this is going to be a great show, and I am ready to dive in.
Sure, let's do it.
Thanks. So since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, the drug, garb, and PPE shortages have led to many temporary guidances, as everybody's aware of, that came through the FDA and other regulatory bodies. Specifically, there have been several temporary policies issued for compounding pharmacies and outsourcing facilities to lend guidance to PPE practices for sterile compounding and alleviate some of the drug shortages resulting from the pandemic. So they're trying to help loosen things up. But today, I want to cover those guidances, mitigating risk to consumers and compounding sites, as well as the impact to both the 503A and 503B facilities. Sure. But before we jump into that, Eric, I was hoping that you could begin talking about before we start talking about the temporary guidances, I should say, I was hoping that you could cover for our listeners with an overview, the regulatory requirements that existed for compounding facilities prior to the onset of the COVID-19 public emergency.
Yeah, sure. So what's interesting about pharmacy compounding, Stacey, is that prior to 2004, there was no enforceable national standard that oversaw the practice of sterile compounding or even non-sterile compounding, but we'll stay in the sterile compounding space for now. That was always left up to the individual state boards of pharmacy. So we have 50 states, we have 50 state boards of pharmacy, and similar to the current regulatory schema, you have federalism, you have the federal government, and we even see that getting played out now in our current state of events.
Right.
But basically, the state boards of pharmacy have the ability to regulate sterile compounding. And some states have regulations and some states didn't have regulations. And over the years prior to 2004, there had been a concern that pharmacy wasn't using good contamination control procedures, good practices to protect the patients and to prevent contamination. And so in 2004, the USP issued USP Chapter 797, which defined, the standard of practice, the quality system that was required for sterile compounding under a pharmacy model. Now, that was different than manufacturing. So the FDA regulates manufacturers and new drug applications and abbreviated new drugs, but boards of pharmacy, because what pharmacists do is they prepare medication specific to a patient.
Right.
So let's just say you go to a doctor, Stacey, you have a visit, the doctor prescribes you a medication, it needs to be compounded, you go to your pharmacy, and that pharmacist will compound that medication for you, Stacey. That is different than what a manufacturer does, is that they make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of doses that are used to match a disease. But the physician wrote a prescription to match your specific diagnosis to make sure that you could be treated. And that's the role of a pharmacist. So it's really what they call in the regulatory schema is the iron triad, the relationship between the pharmacist, the patient, and the physician. And as long as that iron triad is maintained, then that's within the purview of USP and the practice of pharmacy.
Sure.
So in 2004, USP promulgated these standards of practice. It was revised in 2008. Like many USP chapters, as we understand the science, as we get more experience using a standard, we understand what works, what doesn't work, what needed to be improved, what needed to be tweaked. And so in 2008, there was a major revision. I had the pleasure of serving on the USP committee during that period of time.
Okay.
So from 2005 through 13. And the USP committee updated the USP standard, and that is a national standard of practice, then leaves to the Board of Pharmacy whether they want to enforce it. So USP has no enforcement authority. They just write the standards, and then it's up to the state boards of pharmacy to decide whether they're going to enforce those standards. Believe it or not, here we are almost 16 years later after the first version of USP 797 came out, Stacey, is that we have only about 36 states that require compliance with the standard, which is terrifying when you think about it, is because
very
we have this
scary, yeah,
uneven playing field. So like the citizens in Massachusetts are getting different care potentially from the pharmacist than practicing in Pennsylvania or in Missouri or in Oregon. So so we have this uneven playing field, and that really concerned the FDA. And then in the background, you also had pharmacies operating outside of the traditional scope of pharmacy, which is they were not filling individual patient prescriptions. They were making bulk quantities of compounded medications that were routinely used. And hence, that's where we see the New England compounding event rear its ugly head in 2012.
Sure.
Because that pharmacy was operating illegally. They were not following the laws of Massachusetts.
They were essentially a manufacturer, but not following the manufacturing guidelines, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were gaming the system between the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy and the FDA on who had jurisdiction. So USP is the standard that all basically is an expectation that pharmacists embrace, and that quality system is used when they do sterile compounding. So so I would say generally now in 2020, there is an overarching sense that it's a best practice in many states, but in a majority of our states, it is a mandated requirement to comply with the USP chapters on compounding.
Absolutely. And at some point, following some incidents that had negative impact on patients, the FDA, correct me if I'm wrong, did divide these types of compounding pharmacies into two sectors. So that's the 503A and the 503B.
Right.
So what are the biggest differences in the way each of those was regulated? And we're still talking pre-COVID, so I don't want to talk about what's changed since, but what's the biggest differences between those two classifications?
Right. So as a result of that catastrophic event that happened with the New England Compounding Center in Massachusetts in 2012, the FDA was able to, or Congress passed legislation called the Drug Quality Security Act. And that is where it created the clear separation between the practice of pharmacy and what is now called 503B or outsourcing facilities. So this was a new provision of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that the FDA actually, Stacey, had been trying to get changed since 1998.
Wow.
And what happened was that what set up the perfect storm for New England compounding was in 1998, Congress passed the FDA Modernization Act. And there was a provision that said if pharmacies behave in the following manner, they're really not pharmacies, they're manufacturing. And one of those provisions was advertising the compounding of a specific medication, methylprednisolone. That's not what pharmacists do. They compound prescriptions.
Special,
they don't they don't manufacture or compound a specific drug.
Right.
Well, the problem was that that was a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And so the Supreme Court ruled that provision of the FDAMA Act, the FDA Modernization Act, as unconstitutional. And it created this uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty of what do you do with pharmacies that engage in this kind of compounding activity that does not fall into the traditional patient-specific compounding.
Right.
And their advertising, and it allowed operators like New England Compounding to flourish. And then it created that perfect storm where actually the statistics today are over 100 patients have died from that, 800 infected, and still there's the long-term consequences of that. So finally, we needed this catastrophic event to get everybody to get the act together, and Congress said, okay, 503A, patient-specific, traditional compounding. You follow USP chapters on compounding, so that would be 795 for non-sterile, 797 for sterile. And then you, compounding pharmacies, we will allow you to compound non-patient specific in limited quantities if you follow our rules. And so the FDA, since that time, has promulgated dozens of guidance documents that both direct, believe it or not, both 503A compounding and 503B. And what people have to understand is the importance of the USP chapter, Stacey, is it creates a safe harbor for pharmacy to compound, because the FDA has always considered any compounding of a medication is considered a new drug, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yes.
Right. But especially if it's outside of the approved package, the instructions for use.
Right.
But they say that if you're operating within a pharmacy model and you're filling a prescription for a specific patient, you're exempt from all of the GMPs, except for the one condition known as the insanitary conditions, which is the overarching, what I'll call compounding martial law, which says, regardless of whether you're a pharmacy or a manufacturer, that if you make something that jeopardizes the quality of a compounded medication or a manufactured medication, that's considered an insanitary condition, and the FDA can mandate that you resolve your insanitary conditions that can cause harm to patients. So that is kind of the precursor to all of the temporary guidances that have been promulgated in the last 3 months. So the guidance has been USP chapters on compounding, 503A, here's your guidance, patient-specific, USP chapters, 503B, draft guidance, GMP, and so it created that bright line between what the practice of pharmacy and these other compounding activities that were required just because of the drug shortage situation. Because again, that's the other thing with the outsourcing facilities, is their whole role was to try to alleviate the burden of the drug shortages that we're experiencing in the United States.
Right. So, right. And that's what happened. So COVID comes in, thank you for the background, by the way, just so our listeners are caught up.
Sure.
On all of the issues with compounding, because sometimes the industry takes a bad rap because of those major incidents with the New England compounding facility. But now here we are in the midst of drug shortages, as you mentioned, with limited supplies. Compounders may be busier than ever, and many guidances keep changing. So, to me, that's a little bit scary in itself. But the guidance is around compounding certain drugs for hospitalized patients, during this pandemic, aim to support hospital resources, as you alluded to, as many FDA-approved drugs needed for patient care were not available.
Right.
So what kind of impact would you say this has on registered pharmacies versus non-registered pharmacies?
Well, so I just want to clarify, when we say registered pharmacies, are we talking about the 503Bs?
Right. So right. So yes. And and I think that there were some compounders, correct me if I'm wrong, that fell into maybe a different category than they would pre-COVID because of added tasks they picked up, or could possibly under the temporary guidances. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that. kind of
Yes.
the impact here.
Yeah, no problem. So, if I can just go back just a little, I
Sure.
think one of the questions you asked me, which I don't think I answered sufficiently, is what's the major differences between a 503A and a 503B?
Right.
So a 503A does patient-specific medications pursuant to a prescription, right?
Right.
They can do some anticipatory compounding, so they can make medications that they get prescriptions for routinely, but on a limited supply basis. And that has been drawn up in guidance that the FDA has issued. Basically, the FDA says that a pharmacy can compound up to a 30-day supply of routinely dispensed medication so they can maintain quality, and it's just easier from an efficiency.
Sure.
But it all has to do based on prescriptions. So for me to do that, I would have to, if the FDA came in and said, well, why do you have so many doses of this drug X on your shelf? I can say over the last 30 days that I have filled, 50 prescriptions with this quantity. So this is really my stock, my ongoing using
for
working
refills
stock.
And yeah, right.
Exactly. So that's what pharmacy can do, and 503As have to follow the USP chapters on compounding. 503Bs, basically the FDA says you don't need a prescription. You can compound medications that are on the drug shortage list or to meet the demands of a hospital pharmacy. And because of the USP chapters, many hospitals decided they didn't want to spend the money to update their sterile compounding infrastructure in the hospital. And so they instead of making it, they decided to buy it. So they were outsourcing it to these centralized hubs that could then fulfill the drug demand for these compounded medications without a prescription. So that is the major difference, Stacey, between a 503A is patient specific, 503B is not patient specific, and it's meeting a need of a hospital. A 503B cannot wholesale, so they can't sell it to a wholesaler who then sells it to a hospital. They have to sell directly to the end user, the hospital, the doctor's office, because that was another practice that became what I'll call a gateway for abuse, was compounding for office use. Is these pharmacies getting into the business of mass producing drugs that were routinely used in office procedures. It's an important part of healthcare that we need to be able to, pharmacy or somebody needs to be able to meet those pharmaceutical demands at the patient physician office practice level, but you have to do it safely. And so the A's can't do it, but the B's can. And that's the other provision, is being able to create a mechanism where hospitals and physicians' office can get compounded non-patient specific medication. So that separates the differences of the two. So
thank you for that clarification.
Well, I'm sorry?
I said thank you for the clarification. Yeah. That's helpful. So now, if you could just address a little bit what the impact has been to these 503As and 503Bs,
right,
with some of these temporary drug guidances.
Right. So probably one of the first things is that one of the key guidances is that the FDA said that 503As can compound medications, and there was a list of 10 or 12 medications that were published in the FDA guidance that said a 503A can compound limited quantities of non-patient specific drugs that are key to fight the public health emergency associated with the COVID-19. Because what was happening is that as soon as the COVID crisis happened, the pandemic happened,
right.
What ends up happening in our industry, Stacey, is we get this hoarding going on, this drug hoarding, this PPE hoarding, and it creates these artificial shortages that the manufacturing capacity of the industries that make PPE or drugs can't respond quick enough, right? They have limited, what they call excess capacity to respond to these artificial shortages.
Right.
People started hoarding these drugs. things became shortage, and these 10 or 12 medications were critical to treating patients in ICUs that had the COVID diagnosis. And so to ease that crisis, that drug shortage crisis, the FDA said that 503As can, in limited quantity, compound non-patient specific medications to meet the need of a local hospital. Because a lot of the compounding pharmacies, big and small, have relationships with their local hospitals.
Right.
And many of them have gotten into the business of engaging in sterile compounding as a core aspect of their business. And so this allowed them to engage in commerce, compounding activities that were otherwise prohibited because of the risks associated with abuse and safety and quality. And so the FDA was just trying to make sure that our healthcare system can be supported by an infrastructure that, even though it increased the risk, because of the traditional guardrails and the traditional safety factors that were built into these guidances prior to the COVID pandemic, that the FDA said, okay, we have to take care of patients. We understand there's an elevated risk, but if we do it safely, we do it methodically, we do it thoughtfully, and we limit the amount of medications that are out there, right? Because time and temperature are our enemy. If we make things under less than ideal conditions, there is a greater risk of contamination. And the longer that medication sits around, excuse me, the greater chance you have of microbial colonization and microbial growth. And then it presents a fairly significant health risk to the patient. So
because these drugs are not made like traditionally manufactured drugs. They have some preservatives in them, and they go through stability testing, so you know how long they can sit around. But if it's a compounded drug, that without those elements, then it needs to be used quickly, I would think. Yeah. Right.
So it's all risk mitigation. So if I allow you, let's just say under normal conditions, a drug could be given a 90-day beyond use date or expiration date.
Right.
Under less than ideal conditions, the way you mitigate risk to the patient is to shorten the BUD, right? So it's not sitting around. So you're just in timing all these medications. And so this guidance allowed the 503As to go ahead and do that as the immediate need. And then the other provisions for the Bs, Stacey, was that they allowed them to start making drugs that were what quote unquote essential copies. So things that were already commercially available and FDA approved. The FDA didn't want to allow these 503Bs to taint the drug approval process. Think about this. If the FDA allowed the 503Bs full state of control, what incentive would there be for any of the generic manufacturers or innovator pharmaceutical companies to do what they have to do on these new drug applications? Because
that makes sense. That makes total sense.
And that's why compounding and having that relationship to a patient is very important. That defines the major differences. So it really allowed them certain exemptions and allowances to meet a specific patient healthcare need because of the drug shortages. And so the FDA basically enlisted A's and B's to be able to try to shorten and address that crisis.
Right. And Eric, compounders were impacted by other types of temporary guidances as well, not just around the drug shortages. Certainly that was a major one, but I think everybody's familiar with the supply chain issues and shortages of everything from masks and respirators to gloves and gowns.
Right.
And specific guidances or temporary guidances introduced to alleviate shortages for those types of processes came into play as well, including those focused on decontamination and reuse of certain PPEs, as well as limitations on the number of personnel that could be conducting sterile compounding at any one given time. So how effective do you think these temporary guidelines have been at helping compounders to be better during this time of COVID? Or not to be better, but to be more efficient and responsive, I guess, would be the better.
If I could read something from, almost every FDA guidance document you read, and I'm sure you've read a lot of them, Stacey.
Yes.
The FDA always puts this default language. It says under the FD&C Act, a drug is adulterated if it has been prepared, packed, or held under insanitary conditions whereby it may have been contaminated with filth or hereby may have been rendered injurious to health. And so this is known as the insanitary conditions provision. Right. And the FDA has identified several key criteria that would label something as an insanitary condition. And one of those was using the appropriate PPE. So we had this looming insanitary condition citation hovering over 503As and 503Bs because the FDA doesn't care who you are. Their role from a public health perspective is to make sure that whatever is compounded is safe and it's not going to be injurious to health.
Right.
And so these guidance documents basically said it's okay, you normally are required to wear a hairnet, a mask, a fresh mask, because again, a mask is a single-use item, right? Whether it's absolutely. An N95 or a regular surgical mask, we want you to use sterile gloves, right? Because, personnel are the dirtiest thing in a controlled environment where manufacturing or compounding is happening. So if you don't have these safety factors, the PPE, the right PPE, the sterile gloves, the sterile alcohol, that increases the risk of contamination to this compounded medication, whether it's done on a patient-specific basis or in a batch basis.
Of course.
And so the FDA is saying, we know that you can't get these required elements to protect your patients. And we would normally cite you with an insanitary condition if you didn't meet those standard criteria in terms of PPE. We're going to use enforcement discretion in this situation because of the shortages and because of the crisis and the hoarding, because you still need to take care of patients.
Right.
But we're going to, I don't want to say look the other way. We're going to say, we understand this is an exception. Now, the problem with any exception, then it becomes, well, nothing really bad happened. So why can't we stay, right, at this lower level? And the problem with that is that we don't, to answer your question is, we don't know if it has been harmful to patients. Like we're not seeing outbreaks, right? We're not seeing events like the New England compounding or some of these outbreak events that have happened associated with bad compounding. Right. I think here you have a very, a really high risk population. We know that COVID patients, once they're in the hospital, they have a higher probability of death than other diseases just because of how sick they are. So can we say that, did not following those traditional rules, those traditional safety guidances, did that negatively or positively impact that patient's outcome? We don't really know, because that's really our biggest challenge we have, Stacey, in sterile compounding, is that no one is tracking the events associated with sterile compounding, right? And then the other thing is, how do you differentiate when you think about a patient that's in the hospital, right? They could have had surgery, they could have had catheters, they could have, all kinds of invasive procedures going on.
Right. You don't really know what the source of the issue would be.
Exactly. So how do you separate, right? How do you differentiate an infection caused by a poorly compounded medication from some other invasive procedure that was done, because the signs and symptoms there's no differentiating sign and symptom.
Of course, that makes total sense. Yeah,
So,
it's impossible to trace.
Right, So we don't know the incidence of these bad events unless we have these outbreaks, like New England and some of the other ones that have been reported in the press. So I think to meet the need, I think it gave people that, to use the golfing term, a mulligan. They said, we're going to give you this because we know that you're trying to meet a patient need, and this is a public health emergency, but this is not the standard of practice. And when the FDA and CDC decides that public health emergency is no longer in effect, then they're going to go back to the traditional, to the historical guidance documents. But I think in responding to the need, pharmacy and others didn't have to keep looking over their shoulder as they're trying to solve a problem and worrying about that they're going to be liable or cited for not following the guidance that is on the books. And so these were ways to just recognize and memorialize the fact that we're dealing with a crisis. This is a less than ideal situation. We're meeting a public health emergency. This is only temporary guidance. We think that the guidance is reasonable and should not generally cause more problems than it solves. So, it's like the operation was a success, but the patient died. It won't have injurious effects to a patient.
And to your point, the FDA does ask and continues to ask compounders to weigh the risk versus the benefit to the patient in this whole process, right? So the drugs that you are compounding and the methods you're using to compound them really should be essential to the patient care under this temporary guidance, right? So it's not just willy-nilly. I mean, there's still definitely rules that are being followed and recommendations from the regulatory agencies here. And I think you spoke well to the short-term impact that we're seeing right now to compounders, in that they are getting a pass, if you will, for things that they would be cited for under pre-COVID regulations. Do you see all of these temporary guidances impacting the industry into the future? Following this temporary guidance period, and we know they'll stop at some point. When, we don't know yet, but we're all assuming that they will at some point as soon as this is under control. And what lasting impact, if any, do you think that may have?
Well, I think what's going to happen, Stacey, is it's going to cause all parties to go back to the table and start talking about this. Compounding is a very emotional topic in the healthcare industry. No one likes to be regulated. And, I've been a pharmacist. I've been in healthcare, been a pharmacist for 37 years. I've been in the healthcare setting for 40 years, generally, medicine is a practice. We're meeting the needs of an individual patient with all of these confounding influences on the care of a patient. And it requires us to be creative at times. And for pharmacy, because, believe it or not, when I was in pharmacy school, I had an elective class in compounding. Compounding is taught as an on-the-job, like an apprenticeship model. What I call tribal lore. It's storytelling. We through the ages, we tell stories and we use words to describe how to do these compounding activities. And the problem is that the way I look at the profession of pharmacy is we don't know what right looks like in pharmacy, but we have big pharma. And the challenge for me has been, I worked for Baxter Healthcare in the 90s. And as a pharmacist, I got trained in GMPs, and I could see the difference between big pharma and GMPs and pharmacy. And, the analogy that I like to use, Stacey, is if you're familiar with Cub Scouts, Pinewood Derby,
Yes.
the little wooden cars. The analogy is USP 797 is to Pinewood Derby as NASCAR is to GMPs.
Right.
So
Okay.
when you think about the precision and the cost and the expertise at NASCAR and GMPs is different than a father and son hacking at a piece of pine, a block of pine wood, to put four wheels in. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to pharmacy, but at times it seems that it's pretty loose. And I think what's going to happen is when USP started promulgating all these standards, the boards of pharmacy started holding people accountable. Pharmacy's quality budget went from zero to tens of thousands of dollars. It was really hard to quantify the value of spending money for sterile alcohol and sterile gloves and all of these things that add cost to the system, right? Mm-hmm. We know that in manufacturing, quality costs a lot of money, but it's designed because we have patient safety. So,
exactly.
So to answer your question, I think what's going to happen is because the FDA relaxed these fairly rigid standards of practice, the pharmacists will argue there was no harm caused to patients by relaxing these very rigid, expensive, what will be viewed as unnecessary, unfunded federal mandated requirements. And I think what it will do is the pendulum will swing more to the middle, because what happened was when New England compounding happened, no state in the union wanted to be like Massachusetts, right?
Right.
Or the Board of Pharmacy was absolutely embarrassed, and the Board of Pharmacy got a bad rep in Massachusetts. They were not given, believe it or not, legislatively, they were not given the power to properly oversee compounding and pharmacies in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. But part of it was a legislative thing. So now what people are going to say is, we want the FDA to come back to the table. We want USP to come back to the table. We want to revisit these very onerous, expensive, tedious, what is viewed as non-value activities, and try to come up with a balance. So I think the good thing is that maybe this is just going to allow us to course correct and say, did we go over the top or did we miss something? And I think what the most important thing to me, the way I'm looking at it, Stacey, is it's going to open the dialogue to re-examine the standards and try to come up with a middle ground that everybody can be happy with. Not that that's going to happen, but maybe we can get better acceptance, and some things that are unnecessary can be eliminated, and some things that need to be improved can be implemented.
Sure. And only time will tell, really.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's very plausible and easy to see how that might be the outcome. And hopefully it does, hopefully the FDA and USP and all of the regulatory agencies have been working really hard to meet the needs of the patient and still maintain some guidelines in a relaxed manner. And I think that proves that they can play ball, right, with people. So anyway, Eric,
yep.
Talked about the 503As and the 503Bs and the impact of the temporary guidances for drugs and PPE. But there were also temporary policies surrounding the compounding of alcohol-based hand sanitizers,
right?
Not only for medical facilities, but for consumers alike, because, nobody could find those products on the shelves anymore.
Right.
And I heard a lot of talk about the proper ratio of ingredients, especially as non-medical facilities, non-compounding facilities began producing these products. We heard everything from perfume makers to distilleries quickly changing gears, right, and starting to not compound, but to create hand sanitizers. And, there's, of course, the sterile IPA requirements that compounders are using,
right,
et cetera. So Can you shed some light on the integrity, quality, and risks here? I mean, I guess this is sort of post-event a little bit because the supply chain's catching up with those products. But I mean, to me, that seemed a little, I don't want to say scary, but just a little uncertain, because as I understand, there's a specific type of alcohol that should be used and specific ratios of the mixture. And you wonder if a lot of these facilities, especially the mom and pops, were following any of this guidance.
Yeah. So as soon as, because again, like you said, the hand sanitizers, I'm sure we're all familiar with, I think it was in Tennessee, those two brothers drove around the state and bought, $20,000 worth of hand sanitizer. I mean, just, at people, capitalism at its worst. So I think what ended up happening very quickly is that both USP and the FDA worked together and published formulas, recipes, for alternative strategies on hand sanitizer. So let's go back and talk specifically, because you mentioned sterile alcohol. The major difference, alcohol is kind of our all-purpose, very good disinfecting agent, right? We know that it can kill a lot of things, but there are also things that it has no effect. And one of the biggest concerns in pharmaceutical industry is spore-forming microorganisms, gram-positive spore-forming organisms. And the problem, Stacey, is IPA, isopropyl alcohol, does not kill spores. And the reason that we use sterile IPA in our manufacturing is that it has been filtered. So it's filtered to remove the spores.
Right. Because
spores, Bacillus cereus has been involved in many of these outbreaks, even in non-sterile in non-sterile formulations. You think about children's Tylenol and some of these non-sterile oral formulations, you can get sick from having Bacillus. Right. So sterile alcohol has been filtered and gamma irradiated to ensure there's no spore formers in there. So you have something that will effectively disinfect surfaces, injection ports, critical surfaces, part of the manufacturing process. But when sterile alcohol now is in short supply, in shortage, because of demand, because of hoarding, what do? You go to the next thing, which is IPA, which is still a disinfectant, but it could have spore formers in it because it's not made under sterile conditions. It's not processed to be sterile. And so that increases the risk. Now, the delta between non-sterile alcohol and sterile alcohol is probably anywhere between 10 and 30-fold. So from a cost perspective, because of the cost of processing that.
Right.
And then everybody says, well, why am I spending so much money on sterile alcohol now? Because literally a pint of sterile alcohol can be $10, Stacey.
Sure.
And a pint of non-sterile alcohol is $1. So there's a 1 to 10 there. So, are we spending money unnecessarily for the risk associated with it? And we don't know.
And so especially because hand sanitizer obviously is for surface contamination, right? It's killing any bacteria that's on your hands or skin. It's not meant to be ingested. So does it matter at that point about spores? And I'm asking because I really don't know. No,
I would say for the purposes of hand disinfection, it doesn't matter because I don't believe, and again, I'm having a brain cramp here, but I'd have to look at the guidance again. What I always tell people is, when in doubt, go to the source of truth, right? Go to the guidance. Don't rely on, a talking head like me or someone who may or may not recall it correctly. Always go to the source of truth. Go to the USP chapters, go to the FDA guidance. So when we're talking about a topical application versus an application that would be used in a manufacturing environment or a compounding environment, the level of quality in terms of microbial contamination doesn't have to be the same. The whole idea is to kill the COVID virus. That was the goal of the hand sanitizer,
Right.
is not to disinfect surfaces, that you prevent microbial contamination during manufacturing or compounding. So this was an alternative strategy, again, to look at, okay, we have our traditional formula, but now because of these ingredients that are on drug shortage or are no longer available, here are alternative formulations that allow you to formulate something that will be effective in being a hand disinfectant.
And I also read somewhere in these guidances that the 70% isopropyl alcohol was a better product for killing these types of germs on hands versus a higher level alcohol like the 90 or 91%.
Right.
And yet, and I'm just saying, in my local market, I definitely saw a lot of instances with very small or mom and pop, manufacturers of these products, that they would say, oh, well, we got 90% or 91%, it's better. And I'm like, actually, it's not better.
Right.
And so I think I had some concerns about that too. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, is what ends up happening is the whole goal of a disinfectant is to get into the cell membrane to disrupt it. And the problem is that you need water, right? So we know that you need at least, if my memory serves me correctly, at least 62% alcohol to have an antimicrobial effect.
Mm-hmm.
And the normal 70% IPA, right, that we would buy in our local pharmacy or supermarket, okay? The other portion of that is water. What you have to do is you have to hydrate the microorganism to allow the alcohol to work.
Right.
Because if you use like 100% alcohol or 95% alcohol, what you do is you desiccate, you dehydrate the microorganism, and then the alcohol can't kill it. So as long as you are maintaining at least, I think it's 62%, upwards to 70, 75%, you can certainly start with like Everclear, like 100% IPA.
Yeah.
And then dilute it down, and you'll see that almost every one of those formulas had some form of water in there. Because again, it's all about a recipe, and it's, even in the kitchen, I've been watching the British Bake Off show, and they talk about proofing and time and temperature. Same thing happens in pharmaceuticals. Same thing happens with disinfectants, is you need the right ratio of ingredients for it to have its maximum effect.
Understood. That makes perft sense.
So sometimes more is not better.
Yeah, exactly. So, Eric, obviously, there's a lot of temporary guidances and some relaxed things happening in the industry right now. But obviously, record keeping is still important. What kind of record keeping has been required for compounders surrounding compounding performed with non-standard PPE, changes to sterilization practices, and mitigation strategies during this COVID time? And how does that compare to pre-COVID practices?
Yeah, so the two words, the two words I would start this conversation is peanut butter. So you're probably saying, why peanut butter? So if you remember all those years ago, we had that recall of peanut butter because it was contaminated. And the problem, Stacey, in healthcare is that we don't have a good ability, especially pharmacy does not have a good ability to recall a drug. Well, we can recall it, but we can't trace it to a patient. We know with the recall of like the romaine lettuce, remember the E. coli with the romaine lettuce and the contamination in the peanut butter? Food stores can do a better job recalling food than healthcare can in recalling drugs. And it's all about impact, right? It's all about risk versus benefit. And in the guidance document, the FDA was suggesting, right, it's a should. It's real important that we look at the verb choices, right? Should versus must or shall. Shoulds are considered best practices, right? You should do this, you should do that. Well, that doesn't have any sense of authority to it, right? That's a should is It's a good thing if you do it, but a must or a shall is a requirement. And the whole thing is, if we're trying to mitigate patient risk and we want to protect patients, the FDA was saying, if you make decisions where you are operating under less than ideal conditions or traditional guidance documents,
yes,
you should have the ability to trace and track, or track and trace, those medications made during those periods of time and who got them. So in the event of an outbreak, you can do an investigation and you have traceability and recallability. And so that is one of the key areas that the FDA has been fighting with pharmacy and these outsources, is because mass casualties, right? We see it with New England compounding. I mean, if your physician writes you a prescription and I, as a pharmacist, compound it,
right,
and I make it wrong, there's a relationship one-on-one, and I can trace it back, and there's a way for me to realize or say, hey, Stacey, don't use that medication. We have some information. If I make 10,000 doses and I send it out into the health systems without any traceability, if some outbreak happens, how do you even recall it? How do you even do any kind of investigation and understand the impact? That earlier question that you asked me. So it really is very important. And to your point, it really is in pharmacy's best interest to operate as a good practitioner, to be able to understand who was put at higher risk during a period of time, and having that traceability, that documentation in place to say, these were the conditions that I was following on these days, and these were the medications that I made those days during those less than ideal conditions, and these are the patients that received them. Not because I was being irresponsible, but now because, God forbid, something should happen,
right,
I would have the ability to do some recall, to do some traceability, to do some investigation, and to be able to follow up on any concerns that there might be associated with the medication that I compounded.
So it sounds like the record keeping was just as effective or just as stringent as it always is.
Well, now funny you should say that, because there's, prior to so USP, as I mentioned, USP 797, 2004, 2008.
Mm-hmm.
The current standard is the 2008
version, right?
There's no clear record keeping requirement, Stacey, which is terrifying if you think about it.
That is a little bit unnerving.
Right? I mean, you would think best practice, right? If I make a medication for you, I should record the lot number and expiration date of all my ingredients.
Right.
The problem is that, a lot of people look at this as time consuming, and they're like, there's no value to it. I never have a problem. And they say, unless there is a regulation, I'm not going to do it. And so this is where, as a professional, it's better to self-regulate than have someone regulate me. And I know what's best practice, and I should do things that aren't necessarily mandated. And so, believe it or not, depending on the state, because it's not consistent, there is no uniform requirement for you to document lot number and expiration date for every medication. The 2019 revision of USP 797 now changes that requirement. They do require that even one single dose for one patient, one time, there is some record keeping. It's called a compounding record. If you make a batch, then it's a master formulation record. But this was, again, another way to say, if you're operating under less than ideal conditions, we would really like you to be able to track and trace that medication back to a patient. God forbid something should happen.
Absolutely. So, so these types of items, the lack of guidance for paperwork, let's say paper trails, and the bigger incidents like with the New England compounding facility in Massachusetts, have really left all compounders to be scrutinized by, folks outside of the compounding industry. So I mean, the industry has stepped up tenfold during this COVID pandemic, and really a lot of the compounding that's been done has been vital to keeping the health system going, right? And so I'm just curious, do you think that all of these temporary guidances and all that the compounders have been able to do to help has positively impacted the industry's reputation? Or, I mean, I'm hoping that some good comes out of this. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
I think, great question. I think this event, this public health emergency, shows the how important compounding is for patient care.
Agreed. I agree.
And if you think about it, all of the angst and all of the regulations and all of the regulatory and all of these pre-pandemic crises have really forced pharmacy to step up its game, forced healthcare to step up its game. And it allowed us, it's almost like all of the things that have happened the last 20 years have prepared us for this moment in time to be able to respond to a public health crisis where it shows the criticality of pharmacy's role in addressing a public health crisis where patients need medications, and pharmacy should be better prepared in 2020 than they were in 2000 to respond to this crisis, because we've been living under regulations, we have mandated rules, we have oversight, we have inspection. As I like to say, people respect what other people inspect, right? So we know that because of the increased scrutiny and the oversight, we've had to up our game and be better at what we do. And I think this has positively reflected on pharmacy's ability to be a key player in solving this public health crisis. And this, I think, is a gold star for pharmacy. I think this has really shown the importance, because if you think about it, Stacey, one of the things that may not be apparent to the public is that there has been a shift in pharmacy. Like I'm an old school educated pharmacist, and it was clinical pharmacy was important, but pharmacy had always been about dispensing and distribution and compounding.
Right.
There is, because of the public health crisis, right? You think about telemedicine, you think about the CMS, you think about the recognition of pharmacists being able to do COVID testing and to do these other things that has traditionally been ascribed to physicians and nurse practitioners. Right. So pharmacy is now expanding its ability to participate in the clinical practice side, but our core fabric of our profession is compounding, right? Is meeting the pharmaceutical needs of a patient. And I think all of the things that have preceded the pandemic have prepared us for this moment of time. So it shows that we can be a valued contributor, a team player, someone who can provide care and meet a need that this public health emergency has caused. And I think it's a positive.
Very well said. I would agree. And I was hoping you were going to agree with that as well. One final question for you, and it has to do with a comment you made earlier in our discussion about the number of states who are actually following the compounding guidelines. I think you said 34 or 35 states.
Standards, USP standards.
USP standards.
Sorry.
And so the FDA's compounding memorandum of understanding with states was issued just last month for public viewing. They're still taking comments on it, of course. It hasn't, nothing else has happened with it yet. Do you anticipate, what type of impact, I guess, do you anticipate for the compounding industry if and when it's finalized?
Okay. So a couple things. So thank you for letting me correct you about guidelines, because that term, so you talk about, pet peeves. See, this is where the confusion comes in, Stacey.
Right.
Is guidelines means voluntary, right? To
Right.
me, it's like best practice.
Of course.
What people, what I'd like to remind your listeners is the USP standards, especially standards less than 1,000, and their numbering system, is considered part of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And technically, every state board of pharmacy requires a pharmacist, a licensed pharmacist, registered pharmacist, because compounding is a legislatively issued right, a privilege. It's not a right. Pharmacists don't have a right to compound. They have a privilege to compound.
Okay.
And so USP standards technically are part of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which technically means pharmacists have to comply with all local, state, and federal regulations. Okay. So, indirectly, even though it might be that my state doesn't mandate compliance with the USP chapters, technically my Practice Act says that I should follow the law, but it's just a standard because USP has no enforcement authority. So it's a standard that's codified by the states, and then that's where the enforcement happens. So thank you for letting me just clarify.
No, I appreciate the clarification because it's important to have that correct.
Yeah, and I think this is where the confusion in the industry, because everybody says USP guidelines. They're USP standards that are then codified or not codified by the state because they have the ultimate authority or the accreditation authority or the accreditation like Joint Commission. But to answer your question about the MOU, that Memorandum of Understanding, that concept actually was first introduced in 1998 in the Food, Drug, and in the Modernization Act that was ruled unconstitutional in 2002 by the U.S. Supreme Court. And if you look at the underlying concerns that the FDA has about the Memorandum of Understanding, Stacey, it's traceability and it's track and trace, right? The FDA is concerned with the distribution of large amounts of compounded medication and not being able to tie it back to a public health crisis. And what the FDA is trying to do is saying, if you ship, right, because the FDA can't regulate intrastate commerce, right, that's up to the states. If I dispense like I live in New Jersey, so as long as I don't cross state borders, the FDA has technically no jurisdiction over my practice. But if I engage in interstate commerce, I'm going over borders. Now the FDA says, well, that's a federal oversight responsibility, right?
Yes.
What they're saying is, how much is too much, even if it is patient specific? How do you ensure that you know who is getting your medication? And this is what the FDA is trying to limit, the risk of these major catastrophic mass casualty events. And it's all tied around this memorandum of understanding. And it creates a fairly, as the critics are calling it, a unfunded federal mandate where you have to set up a monitoring system where you're tracking and tracing medications that go across state borders and any adverse drug events that would be associated with those compounded medications. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Pew Charitable Trust. They did that survey a few years ago that said that only 40% of the states that responded to the question have a requirement of record keeping and monitoring adverse events associated with compounded medication. We know that the drug manufacturers are required under the MedWatch rules to be able to have that pharmacovigilance. There is no pharmacovigilance at a compounding level. Right. And this basically is a way that I think, this is Eric Kastango's interpretation, the FDA just trying to create a pharmacovigilance mechanism that they can monitor for adverse drug effects associated with compounded medication. Because once you start distributing large quantities of medication, that's when the risk increases to patients. And this, I think, is what the the memorandum of understanding, but it's highly contentious. And I think, again, this pandemic is going to bring parties to the table again and allow them to hopefully find a middle ground, because the FDA has taken a pretty hard ass, pardon the expression, a pretty hard stance on this. But again, when all you do every day is see bad things, all you see is bad things, right?
Of course.
and they're the aggregators of just these catastrophic events.
So hopefully this will allow all of the right people, the right players, to sit at the same table and have this discussion.
Exactly.
For the benefit of the industry and the benefit of the patient.
Right. But this whole thing with the MOU, Stacey, this thing has been going on for 22 years.
Okay, so it's not new. So we sit and wait.
Yeah, right. And it's the negotiation, and
right.
I again, see, this is where I would say, as a pharmacist, I would rather create a consortium or work with the boards of pharmacy and create a way to self-report adverse drug events, because I would rather self-regulate than have the FDA regulate, right? As I like to say, we can do it easy or we can do it hard.
Yeah.
Easy, State Board of Pharmacy, Pharmacy of Practice. Hard is going to be the FDA, federal oversight. Let's start self-regulating.
Well, I think you have the opportunity to submit your comments because they are taking them now. So
absolutely,
that's a great suggestion. Well, Eric, we have covered a lot today. Put a lot of great information out there. I want to thank you very much for a great discussion.
Thank you, Stacey. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So thank you. Also, I want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, and an equally big thanks to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or specific guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.